Welcome to this compilation of the most important interface tips for Blender 2.8. It'll be especially helpful if you're moving from 2.7, but even if you're new, you'll learn some new tricks. You can find the full course for free in the link below. Hope you enjoy. The way that you would manage many arrangements of windows in Blender 2.79 is with layouts. You could find these in the top left and switch between many different tasks for many different layouts. So you'd have compositing, game logic, motion tracking, lots of different types of window arrangements, and you could quickly switch between them either using the menu or control left and right arrows. This is a feature that I used quite a bit. Things are a little bit different in Blender 2.8 though, and this idea has been expanded into Workspaces. So now instead of layouts and a menu, we now have tabs along the top. Each tab represents a task that you might use it for, and it's arranged in a particular workflow. If we click between these, you'll notice that of course, our layouts do change, but something else changes as well, and that is the mode that we are in. If we go to Layout, you'll see that we're in Object mode, but if we're in Modeling, you'll see we've jumped to Edit mode. This is particularly interesting because we can now quickly switch between tasks and jump right into the mode that we need without having to do multiple steps to get there. If we go to Sculpting, we'll just jump right into Sculpt mode. This is something that we do need to be aware of and somewhat careful of if we have multiple really high density objects. So if we have 3 objects selected and we switch over to our modeling workspace, all of them will be brought into edit mode. So if you have a really dense mesh, then this may be a little bit slow if you're not careful. What I really like about Workspaces is that they'll remember all of the settings for your UI. For example, when you're sculpting, you may want to be able to see the names of the brushes, so you'll expand the toolbar. But in modeling, you may not even need that and you'll just want to see the icons. When you switch between workspaces, it'll remember that. It'll also remember your viewport shading options and all of the things like that, not just the arrangement of windows and how things are adjusted. For example, in the layout, you may want to have more filter options available in the outliner. So let's just turn a few of these on, and we'll have them available whenever we're in the layout workspace. However, when we switch to modeling, we no longer see those options and things are a bit more simple, and all the options that we don't need here don't have to be visible. If you'd like to make a new workspace, you can click this plus button on the right. There are quite a few pre-made ones that you can choose from, or you could use duplicate current to make your own. That's what I'll do here. To rename it, I'll double click and I'll just call this presentation. This is what I'd use to show off my model once I'm done with it. You can find the settings for Workspaces in the sidebar by hitting N in the 3D viewport and going down to Tool. In the Workspace panel, there are a few different options. First is the mode. I'm going to switch this to Object mode. So now when I switch between these, you can see I'm jumping now to Object mode. You can also filter your add-ons, which is really interesting. So right now, Cycles is the only add-on that I have, so I don't see why I would want to disable that. But if you go to File and Preferences, if you go to Edit and Preferences and you install some add-ons, let's just install, say, Loop Tools and Node Wrangler. And let's do something that has a tab as well. So let's install Hard Ops as well. Okay. So if we choose the filter add-ons here, we can enable these separately per workspace. So if I uncheck this, you can see I have the Hard Ops tab here in my sidebar. But if I turn this on, then that goes away. So I may only want particular add-ons per workspace. And this can be helpful, for example, if you are in the animation workspace and you find that a modeling add-on takes over the hotkeys that you use for animation, then you might disable that only in the animation workspace, but leave it open in the modeling workspace. It's not something that I use all the time, but it's nice that it's there. There are also custom properties, which means that you can do all sorts of cool things with Python using Workspaces now that they have all of their own properties. In this pretend presentation workspace, I'll get rid of all of the things that I won't need for showing off my model. I'll switch over to Look Dev, turn off overlays, get rid of all the windows that I don't need, hide the toolbar, and maybe even hide the header. Let's also disable gizmos. And there we go. So now I have a completely clean workspace, and I can switch between them. Now what you might be wondering now is how to reorder them. We can't drag and drop as would be intuitive. We actually need to right click. So in that menu we can duplicate and delete. We can also reorder to front or reorder to back. we can't move them in smaller increments. We can just shove them to the front or the back, so it may take a few clicks to get them exactly where you want to be. However, once everything's ordered the way that you like it, you can go to File, Defaults, and Save Startup File. Once you do that, it'll save all of your workspaces exactly how you like it, and next time you launch Blender, they'll be ready for you, and you can just jump right into working on whatever you need to do, and everything will be set up just the way that you like it. The tool system is extremely different in Blender 2.8. In 2.79, it was kind of just a collection of actions that you could take all grouped together, but in Blender 2.8, it's a lot more like a toolbar that you'd find in Photoshop or Krita or one of those other creative applications. So it's a bit more familiar for people to use. Now, if you're familiar with Blender already, there are some times when it's really, really useful and other times where it's not. Part of the new tool system is redefining what a tool is. Before, it was somewhat ambiguous, but now it just means something that is active all the time, and when you left click and drag in the viewport, that's what happens. So if we have the box select tool on when we click and drag in the viewport, of course we're going to box select. Now if we want to find a different type of selection, we can click and drag on this option here and select maybe lasso select, and then no matter what we're doing, when we left click and drag, we're going to lasso select. So if we select something and go into edit mode, we can just select things very easily. Let's switch over back to lasso select there. And we can hold shift and make our selections here very, very quickly. Now, if we switch to a different tool, say for example the 3D cursor tool, then we can click and drag and place it wherever we want. Now we also have move tools, rotate tools, and there's a scale tool with an optional scale cage, which is kind of cool, where you can more interactively change the dimensions of your object. And there's also a transform tool, which combines all of them into one widget. Now, if you click and drag anywhere else in the 3D viewport, then it's going to move it around as well. And so this is the reason why I typically don't use these move, rotate, and scale tools, because it's way too easy to accidentally click and drag somewhere way over here in the viewport and move something when that's not your intention. So I'll show you a different way of using these widgets without that in a little bit. But for now, just be aware that lots of these different tools have their own widgets. And when they're active, when you click and drag in the viewport with the left mouse button, that's what's going to happen. So you've got an annotate tool, got a measuring tool, lots of cool stuff. So a lot of this is what you already had in Blender 2.79. Now it's just up front and center. Now if we go into edit mode, as you saw previously, we have quite a few more tools. So not all of the actions possible in Blender are tools. You still need to find things through the menus or use hotkeys for a lot of it. But things that you might want to do over and over again are now tools. So the extrude tool here is pretty handy. You can just click and drag and extrude things outwards like so, very, very quickly. And what's cool about this, as opposed to how things worked before, is that now things like the knife tool are much more interactive. So I can click and place these knife points here. But remember in 2.79, you couldn't really rotate around your view or just do things other than use the knife tool while it was active? Well, now you can. So this just makes it a little bit easier to work with, and it's just a better system overall. Then when you're done, you can of course hit enter, but you're still in the knife tool, so you can click and start new cuts again. Another cool thing about the new tool system is since they mostly all have widgets, some of them don't. For example, edge slide doesn't have a widget to go along with it. You just click and drag somewhere in the viewport and it does the action. But a lot of them do, and the ones that don't are going to get them in the future. But for example, shear was pretty tricky to work with before. It was very difficult to understand exactly what was going on with your object. It was kind of ambiguous and it was view dependent. So you couldn't actually, for example, shear it in this direction in Blender 2.79. So you didn't have all these different axes options. It was only view dependent, and if you weren't looking at it from the right angle, you were kind of just screwed. So this is really, really handy. And another example is the spin tool as well. But I can't actually show you this because it's going in the wrong direction. And this brings up where the tool settings are located. And there's actually quite a few places that you can find them. First of all, you can find them in the tool properties in the properties editor. So here we can switch between the different axes. So if we wanted to spin this in that direction, then we could. So you can see that the widget here makes this much more useful than it was in 2.79. But beyond that, you can find the tool settings either in the properties editor as we just mentioned, or you can find it in the sidebar. If you hit N and go over to Tool, you can find the same settings there. And you can also find them a third place if you right-click on any of these buttons. It's not going to happen if you right-click on empty space in the transparent areas because that'll just bring up the context menu. But if you go to the 3D view header and right-click on a button, go to Header and Show Tool Settings, then you can find it up here on the top. So that way, if you're just working full screen and you don't want the sidebar open, then you can always just switch your options up here. And this can be pretty handy if you're using a pen and tablet for things like sculpting. So not only, of course, are the tools for modeling, they're also for things like painting and sculpting. And by the way, if you want to just maximize your window, that's Control Space instead of Shift Space as it was before. But if we take one of these objects here and we hit Control Tab, bring up our pie menu and go to Sculpt Mode, then you can see that we have quite a few more options here on the left. So these are all now individual tools instead of just one tool with many different types of brushes. So you can see we have a clay strips tool. Let's enable dynamic topology just for this example really quick. I can start painting on this, and I can start kind of messing with this over here. But you'll see the familiar icon from 2.79 over here on the brush properties. But if you click that, you're only going to find one of them. So instead of each of the individual brushes being over here, you can now use these as presets. So if you change some of the options or the stroke methods or the fall off, things like that, you can save that as a new brush, and that will still be in the clay strips tool. So that's a really handy way to organize things a bit better, and it just feels a little bit more natural to switch between them over here in the toolbar as opposed to how it worked before. You'll also find a lot of tools for things like painting. So if we go to UV editing and we wanted to do some painting, let's go to texture paint mode. Then we can find our texture paint tools right over here, as well as if you go to the image editor instead of the UV editor and switch over to paint, you'll also find your paint tools here as well. Now this is where the top bar settings come in handy because you can quickly change your color or your brush radius, things like that, while you're going along. You can also often right click and find some properties there, but that's kind of just dependent on what tool you're using and what mode you're in. So for example, you can find the most basic settings in the texture paint mode, but if you're in sculpt mode, then you'll also find your radius, strength, and auto smooth. Just the most common things to change will be in your right click context menu. Overlays in Blender 2.8 are anything that's drawn on top of your objects, with the exception of gizmos that are not going to be rendered. And you can turn them on or off all at once with this little toggle up here in the top right of the 3D viewport that looks like two overlapping circles. So if we turn this off, you can see that everything that's not going to be rendered goes away, with the exception of gizmos. So let's turn these on and just take a look at what's inside this menu here to the right, which is all the different options for this. So you may have remembered the only render checkbox in Blender 2.79, which did a kind of a similar thing, just turning off all those different overlays in the 3D view. But there are also all these different options for outline selected, all object origins, the grid floor, things like that, as well as grease pencil layers, turning those on or off, motion tracking data, and just all the different things that pertained to displaying information in the 3D viewport was housed in this sidebar. Now in Blender 2.8, it's all consolidated into this one menu, which is pretty handy. So here we have all the options for the grid floor, of course, with the scale, the subdivisions, turning on or off the axes, as well as turning it off entirely. Now the grid over here on the left is grayed out because that's the orthographic grid. So if we go to top view here or side view and go to orthographic view, then we can now turn it off. Beyond that, we can also independently turn off the text info to the top left of the 3D viewport. We can turn off the 3D cursor, which I don't even think was possible at all before. And we could also enable or disable annotations in the 3D view. So any notes that you might have. Underneath that, we have all the different object options. So we could turn on or off extras, which is essentially any Blender object that's not going to be rendered. So cameras, the wireframe of lights, empties, things like that are all considered extras, and you can turn those off all at once. You can also turn off armatures, motion paths, object origins, the little outline around the selected object, as well as relationship lines. Underneath that, there's a brand new option for turning on wireframe for all objects at once, which is really awesome. And there's a slider for how much wireframe you want on your objects. Now this is overridden in the object properties, so even if you turn this completely off and you go to an object, and in the object properties under viewport display, you can still turn on wireframe and that will override it. You can also turn on all edges, and that will force it to display all edges even if the wireframe slider is down pretty low. But even if this is on in the object properties, turning off overlays entirely will still get rid of it. There's also a new and very handy option for face orientation. So if we turn that on, we can see that the normals of the top of this cube are facing the wrong direction. So we can go ahead and tab into edit mode and just select everything, Shift N to recalculate the normals, and now it's all fixed. So you can tell which direction faces are pointing based on the color, and you don't even have to go into edit mode and look at all of those different lines. But once you do go into edit mode, you'll get a whole lot more overlay options as well. Let's go ahead and turn that face orientation off and look at everything beneath that. Of course, there's the motion tracking options that you had before, but in addition to that, specific to edit mode, we have edges, faces, and the face dot centers. So you may have been wondering where those little face dots went, and that's now just an optional checkbox, which you can turn on or off, and it's off by default. You can also enable or disable sharp edges, seams, and things like that here, just the edge data information. This is also where you'll find the hidden wire option, and why it's here and not in the actual shading options is unknown to me, but that's where you'll find it, as well as where you can find your vertex group weights, or if you turn that on and you can flip through all of your vertex groups, you can see that in edit mode without having to go to weight paint mode. You can also turn on your mesh analysis here, which was a completely separate panel in 2.79, where you can check where your overhangs are. This is mostly for 3D printing, so you can see the thickness, where you might need to add a little bit of extra depth if you were to print this. And you'll also find your measurement options here. So if you need to find how long an edge is or the area of a face, you can do that like so. This is also where you can turn on or off normals for your vertices and faces, as well as any freestyle information for the freestyle render engine. So with all those different options, there's a lot to work with here, and it's definitely super customizable, which is really nice. And you can turn it on or off very quickly with this toggle, and it's also in the pie menu if you have that option enabled in the user preferences. So by default, if you hit Z, it's not in the pie menu. However, if you go to Edit and Preferences, under Key Map, go to Extra Shading Pie Menu Items, turn that on, and then when you hit Z, you can swipe up to toggle overlays on or off, which is quite handy. Gizmos are the interactive widgets that you can use to manipulate things in your 3D viewport. And as we've already seen, a lot of these different tools have their own gizmos. So you've got the Move gizmo for the Move tool, the Rotate gizmo for the Rotate tool, and these are very similar to what you found in 2.79. However, some of them have been subtly upgraded. For example, the Move tool, that gizmo, you can now use to move things on 2 axes at once by clicking and dragging those squares. So lots of nice little touches here and there around the interface, but all of these are considered gizmos. So even in edit mode, if you were to go to your extrude tool, this little handle here is considered a gizmo. And you can turn all of these on or off in the gizmos toggle up here on the top right of your viewport. That kind of looks like a bow and arrow. So you can just turn them all off or all on at once if you just don't want to see them. Now, there are quite a few things that are considered gizmos beyond just those handles. You'll notice that this navigation thing in the top right is also turned off as well, so that is considered an interactive gizmo. So if you click on the drop down, you can see that you can turn these things on or off independently. So you can turn off the navigate gizmo, You can turn off the active tools, which is anything that you select in the toolbar, and you can also turn off gizmos for whatever object that you have selected. Now, what's really cool is that you can also turn on the move, rotate, and scale gizmos for your selection tools. So I don't actually use the move, rotate, and scale tools themselves. I usually just stick with either lasso selection or box selection for my left click and drag action. And then in the gizmos, I will turn on move or rotate. So now I can still use the gizmo and very quickly also select things. So this is very handy in edit mode where I want to just select a bunch of vertices with left click and drag, move them around, select more things, move, select move, select move, without having to flip between the move tool and the select tool. So that's a pretty quick way to work. And you can also do that for rotate and scale, of course, and set the orientation of that. So if you want that to be different than your orientation up here on the top, you can see that I'm set to global. And if I set this to, let's say, normal, it'll face a different direction if I'm in edit mode. Okay, so you can see that the Z is pointing that way. However, if I want to switch this from the default to global, I can do that and it will override whatever my regular orientation is. But typically default is the best. But beyond that, there are a few different gizmos just here and there for making things a little bit easier to work with. For example, we have a look at gizmo for the lamp as well as a size. So if we select our light here, we have this little dot that we can click and drag and just look at or point the light at these different objects. So we can drag that onto an object and it'll point directly at it, which is pretty handy. There's also a size option for different lamps. So if we have a point lamp here, and I guess that's not something that we can do. Let's try an area lamp. Increase the size there, and there we go. So I suppose the size only works for the area lamp at the moment, but that's also just a different gizmo. So whether you want to point at things or just change the size of the area lamp, you can do that interactively without having to go into the menus, which is pretty nice. But if you don't want to accidentally do that, then you can just turn those right off. There's ones for the camera as well. For example, the focal length, you can click and drag. So these aren't things that I use too often because generally I just want to use an exact value, so I'll go to the menu anyway. But if you find that easier, then you can do so. And as Blender 2.8 continues to be developed into 2.81, 2.82, there will just be more and more of these things just to make things easier to work with and a little bit more interactive in the viewport.
So let me explain a little bit about the way that the active tools work and how they are context sensitive. So I actually thought the manipulators weren't working properly and I reported a bug, and I shortly found out that it is just me being an idiot. So what am I talking about? So here I am with my character and we're in object mode, and you can see that the gizmo that I'm displaying is our transform manipulator here. But the active tool that I have selected is the box select. So we know that this is the active tool because it's blue up here. So in this instance, the manipulator is going to use our settings up here in the object gizmo. So if we want to turn on the rotate or the scale, we can click these buttons. Now, because I have the tilde key mapped to these manipulators, I can also hit the tilde key and bring up this pie menu and say if I want to just show the move manipulator, that's what we do. And this will probably be collapsed for you. If we wanted to extend it, I can hold shift and then add or subtract any of these different modes. That's all well and dandy. But where does the confusion come in? Well, this active tool is context sensitive. It's going to remember the last tool that you have selected in each of the modes. So when I was animating and I wanted to jump into pose mode, and I wanted to show the different manipulator, I go, oh, hang on, I don't want this rotate manipulator. I want the move manipulator. And hang on, these aren't working. So what's going on in this instance? Well, if we look over here, you can see that my active tool is the rotate tool. So it's going to ignore my settings up here and it's just going to show you the manipulator that's mapped to this particular control. So if you want to show more manipulators than one, you can actually choose the transform one and it's going to show everything, or just make sure that you don't have any of these selected and then it's going to use the settings that you have here. So there we go. Hopefully you've stopped scratching your head now and I've saved you from reporting a bug and embarrassing yourself. What an idiot.
If you don't find the interactive viewport navigation widget very helpful, then you can switch back to the simple axis like in 2.79, but it's a bit of a two-step process. So you can go to Edit and Preferences, and then under Viewport, go to 3D Viewport Axis and switch from Interactive Navigation to Simple Axis. But you'll notice that you still have the navigation buttons to the left of that, and if you turn off your widgets here, then it turns off everything all at once. So you may not want that, so what you need to do is to go to Interface and then turn off navigation controls, and now you just have that simple axis like before. That's a bit less intrusive. Viewport navigation is only slightly different in Blender 2.8. You have this interactive widget that we already sort of looked at before, that you can click and drag and rotate around your view, as well as use the magnification glass, the hand to zoom in, pan, as well as switch to your camera or go from orthographic to perspective. Just as before, you can of course use your hotkeys on your number pad to switch between front, side, and top view, as well as hitting 5 to jump from orthographic to perspective. So that's all usual stuff. The one new thing here is that you can hold Alt and use your middle mouse button to flick between these different front, side, and top views. So that's very, very useful, and it means that you don't necessarily have to have a number pad in order to quickly get to those views. You can also just click those axes in the interactive widget to jump right to them. Now, a couple things with navigation. If you don't want this interactive widget, you can just turn it off here in the Viewport gizmos under Navigate. You can just turn that off completely. And you may have noticed as we're kind of jumping around that things automatically snap to orthographic view once we go to a front or side view, but then when we rotate around, it pops back into perspective. Now, I find that very useful for modeling, but if that's not something that you find useful, then you can turn that off in Edit and Preferences. If you go down to Navigation, you can turn off Auto Perspective, right like that. And that way, it won't automatically switch you to orthographic. One last note on Viewport navigation is that there's a new hotkey for quickly switching between views, and that is the tilde key, the squiggly line on the top left of your keyboard. If you tap that, then you can bring up a pie menu where you can quickly switch to top, left, right, or bottom views, as well as front, back, view from your camera, or view selected. And this is extremely helpful because before these hotkeys were on the number pad, and when you're working with a laptop, maybe you don't have that. And so it was kind of difficult to actually get to view selected or view from camera without it. So now you can just hit the tilde key and jump right to some of these different areas here, which is really nice. But if for whatever reason you don't need that, you can open up the preferences, go down to key map, and change the tilde action from navigate to gizmos. And when you do that, then you'll instead get a gizmos pie menu to enable them or disable them all at once. Or you can switch between the move, scale, or rotate gizmos and just have those enabled instead of switching between the tools here. So very helpful. I think I will leave it on gizmos when I'm working on my desktop, but for my laptop, I'm definitely going to switch this to navigate. One thing that can be a bit frustrating at first when you're getting used to left click, select, and the new tool gizmo system is that if you try to go ahead and click, say, this face that's right next to it, it's going to click the widget instead. And so you can't select things that are behind the gizmo, and since it takes up quite a big area, it can be a bit of a pain at times. So thankfully there is a solution to this, and you just need to go to Edit and Preferences, then down to Key Map, and then switch the Activate Gizmo from Press to Drag. And what that's going to do is allow you to just select right through the gizmo with a simple click. So in order to activate the gizmo, you now need to actually go ahead and drag it, which is a little bit more intuitive because that's what you're going to do anyway, but you can actually now select things straight through it, and it's a little bit easier to work with. Here's an example of a project where the viewport is getting a little bit messy with all of the different things that I have going on. I've got meshes, I've got curves, I've got cameras, lamps, and empties, all in one scene, and it makes it a little bit messy. So if I'm going through and selecting objects, it's pretty easy to accidentally select the wrong one. Now, there are a couple ways around this. Number one, I've just created a collection for everything that has to do with rendering, so I can just hide that all at once if I want to, and this cleans up the scene quite a bit. But there are also finer tune controls that you can find in the top right next to the gizmos dropdown. So this is called the Objects Types Visibility menu, and you can now turn on or off visibility or selectability for different types of objects. So I find this very helpful. For example, if I still want to see my lights, but I don't really want to disable all of the extras here in the overlays, say I still want to see my camera or things like that, but I just don't want to be able to select the lights. So I can just do that by going down to light and unchecking the selectability for them. So now I can select everything that's behind them. I can still select my camera, things like that, and I can still see where they're placed, but they're not in the way. And I can still, since they still are selectable here in the outliner and in the scene itself, just not in this particular viewport, I can select them in the outliner if I need to. But I just can't select them in the 3D viewport. So you can do that for all different types of objects, and I find that very helpful, especially for bones, sometimes armatures, but it breaks down into each different type of object, so you get very, very fine-tuned control. And of course it is per viewport, so if you have 2 viewports here, and maybe you only don't want to see lights in this one, but you want to see them in this one, then you can do that as well. You may have found in the jump from 2.79 to 2.8 that some of your favorite commands have been shuffled around a bit and are a little bit harder to access. So maybe they're deep in a menu, or maybe there's no longer a hotkey for it. Either way, a nice solution to this is by using the new Quick Favorites menu, and you can find that just by pressing Q. And right now I don't have anything assigned to it, so it's empty. One thing that I used to use all the time that was the hotkey Alt-C was converting things to a mesh. So if I had a bunch of modifiers on here, it would just go ahead and apply them. So you can find that under Object, Convert to, and Mesh from Curve, Meta, Surface, or Text. And you can see that if it's already a mesh, it'll just apply all the modifiers, or if it's a curve, it'll turn it into a mesh, whatever. So I used to use that all the time, but now it's just harder to get to. So we can go to Object, Convert to, Mesh, right-click, and Add to Quick Favorites. Now I can just hit Q in the viewport and do that same thing. We can also do that for like selecting things. So let's do Select All by Type and Mesh, right-click, and add that to Quick Favorites. But you'll notice that the menu item here only says Mesh because the Select All by Type is already kind of inferred by which submenu you used. However, once you add that to the Quick Favorites and you hit Q, it just says Mesh, so it doesn't say, select by type mesh or whatever. So you might have to just remember what it does because it's not entirely clear what mesh is if you forget where you set that from. So that's just something to be aware of. But it's also really nice because you can set things from all different parts of the properties editor as well. So one thing I do all the time is enable auto smooth. So if I go to the object data here, and right click on auto smooth, I can assign that to my quick favorites as well. So now if I shade this as smooth here, hit Q and turn on auto smooth, then you can see that that just works right away and I don't have to go hunting through the properties editor, which is super, super convenient. Now, one thing to be aware of though is that some things apply to many objects when you have them selected and some of them don't. For example, I can take all of these monkeys, right click and shade smooth all of them at the same time. Or I could, convert to mesh all at the same time, whatever. But for some things like auto smooth, it only works on one at a time. So again, this is just something that you have to kind of remember and figure out as you go. It's just one of those quirks. There's nothing really to indicate what does what. Now, those are all just object mode quick favorites, but if we go into edit mode here, then you can see that the menu is empty, but we can set different like mesh editing things. So for example, one I'd use all the time is removing doubles or merge by distance. So we can go down to merge by distance, right click and add to quick favorites. And instead of digging through the menu, I can just hit Q by distance and we're good to go. Blender will now save your preferences by default, which is pretty awesome. To find the user preferences, it's no longer under the file menu, it's now under edit and preferences. And by default, the autosave preferences in the hamburger menu will be checked. And so you won't see a Save Preferences button anywhere near here. But if you make some changes to any of these different menus, then you can just go ahead and close the window and it'll save it for the next time you open Blender, which is awesome. So I actually use this unchecked just because I like to have that like visual, okay, it's saved. Maybe that's just a force of habit, but it's nice to have that just auto-save. And if you auto-save something accidentally, then you can revert to Save Preferences and that will go to the previously saved in case you uncheck a bunch of stuff, close out, but don't want that across all of your blend files, then you can go ahead and revert that, which is pretty necessary if you use the autosave. So beyond that, you can also just load your factory preferences here. And as well, another thing to note is that if you want to save your startup file, say you want to start with a sphere instead of a cube, you can go ahead and make that change and then go to File. It's now under Defaults and then Save Startup File. So it's nice that this actually isn't next to the Save button in the main menu anymore, because there was at least a couple times where I accidentally saved whatever scene I was working on as the startup file, and that was very frustrating and very slow to load every time I opened Blender. So now it's just under Defaults and Save Startup File, and you'll be good to go. In 2.79, you could split windows either by using the 45-degree angled lines on the top right or the bottom left of any window, or you could right-click and do Split Area or Join Area. And 2.8 is very similar, not a whole lot of change, other than instead of the 45-degree angled lines, you now just have rounded corners. And you'll also notice that you can split and join from any corner, not just the top right and the bottom left. So this can be more convenient, but it also means that it's easy to miss a little bit. So you only have like a couple pixels to work with here. You can see the rounded corner is pretty small, and so if you accidentally grab the wrong one, then you can very easily end up just splitting things in the wrong direction. So it can be a little bit finicky to work with, but overall it's very flexible and is pretty fast. You can also still just right-click and let's see, there we go. Right-click and Split Area, and that will draw a line perpendicular to whatever you just right-clicked on. And you can drag this over to any editor, not just the windows next to it, and split an area that way, or right-click and join. So if you find the corners to be a little bit finicky, then you can always do the right-click thing. And also if you line up things exactly, I've noticed that it will kind of lock all the way across, which is kind of cool, depending on if you want that or not. But if you don't want that, I guess you just have to then split it up again. Those are like permanently stuck together until you split that up and then split it down again. There we go. But yeah, if you happen to just like accidentally line it up exactly, which is actually kind of tricky to do sometimes, but then it will lock together, so another thing to be aware of. But overall, it's very flexible, very fast, and works mostly the same, just with a few quirks. When opening an older file from Blender 2.79 or earlier, sometimes things can be a bit weird with the headers all over the place. For example, this file has the timeline header here at the top, while the graph editor header is at the bottom, the 3D view header is at the bottom, the header for the outliner is at the top, and it's just a little bit messy and can be pretty inconsistent. So one thing that's nice that they've done is given us a setting in the user preferences to force all headers to be at the top. And you can find this by going to Edit and Preferences. Under Interface and Editors, just switch the header position from default to top. And then no matter what file you're working in, the headers will all be consistent. Now another little trick is that if you don't want things to use their old workspaces or layouts, and you just want to import just the model, then what you can do is import everything except the UI. So let's just do a new file here and go to File and open up a file. So open up the same one, but uncheck Load UI here in the bottom left. When you do that, it'll open up all of our objects and all of our settings. However, our layout and our workspaces will remain unchanged. So that's another way to keep the headers and keep the Blender 2.8 UI while still working with old files. One little thing that threw me off when I switched to Blender 2.8 was application templates. First, I had a hard time finding them, and that's kind of funny because they're actually right front and center. On the splash screen, they're over here on the left under New File, and all of these are technically templates, and so if you add a custom one, it's going to appear in this list. And if it's not here, then you can just click these triple dots and you'll find it there. So to install an application template, you have to hit the icon button, Blender logo, and then go to Install Application Template, and that's going to be a zip file. If you've never used one before, it's a zip file that has a custom splash screen, a startup.blend, and a user preferences.blend. And the splash screen actually doesn't work in 2.8, the custom splash screen. And also there's a few other quirks as well. So you can see that I have a custom template here. And if I switch to it, you can see that the theme has changed and some of my viewport preferences are a bit different. And that's really nice. But if we go to File and Preferences, or Edit and Preferences, gosh, that's still trips me up every once in a while. And let's say here we switch some of our system settings, and under Viewport, let's change the 3D viewport axis from interactive to simple axis. And then let's just make sure we save our preferences here. And let's show our navigation. There we go. So you can see that's switched to simple axis. So a really simple change. But then if we go to File, New, and go to General, discard changes. So we're going back to what should be a default blend file. It's kept some of these changes from the custom template. So it doesn't actually save all of your things. So it only really applies to the theme and your add-ons. All the changes you make in viewport and interface, lights, and things like that are all shared between different templates. And so that's a little bit annoying, and hopefully something that will be improved in the future, because it would be nice to be able to really have fine-tuned control over these so that I can have one template for doing my personal projects and one template for doing tutorials and things like that, where I'm just assuming people are starting with a default file. So that's something that I found a little bit weird. Hopefully not a lot of people use it, so maybe it's not as important. But if you did use that a lot, hopefully this helps you navigate what still works the same and what's a little bit different in 2.8.
So in Blender 2.8, pie menus are here by default. Now you can turn them off by activating the 2.79 key map or changing your key preferences, but I suggest just getting used to them. So I personally hate them, but I'm getting used to them. So how do we activate them? Well, in our mode selection here, we've got, if I hit the tab key, this is our pie menu, and you can see they're all spread around here. They've got the little numbers on them, 2, 4, 7, 8, 9, 6, so I can hit my numpad. Or you can see some of the letters are actually underlined, and we can actually hit those keys to jump to those mode, or we can obviously select with our mouse. Where they really excel is when you get used to them, that you just move your mouse really fast in the direction that you want to go, and you're going to change that to that mode. Now this is something that takes practice, so stick at it. Even if you hate pie menus like I do, you will get the hang of it. There's one thing I want to show you. If we jump into our user preferences under the interface, we do have menus down here. We do have a few options for changing the speed and the size, etc. of that pie menu. However, we don't have any way to change how fast it confirms. So at the moment, you have to be super duper fast. See, that was too slow. That was too slow. That was fast enough. There we go. So you have to be really fast. There's no way to change that setting. So one of the really common things people want to do when they're drawing inside any application is rotate the canvas. Now for a long time, people thought this wasn't possible to do inside Blender, but it has always been possible, just no one knew about it. So how do we do it? In the front view, I'm going to hold down Shift and press 4 on the numpad to rotate to the left, and then 6 to rotate to the right. If I wanted to reset my view, because I'm looking at the front view, I'm just going to hit 1 on my numpad and it's going to reset the view. Now you're probably trying this at home and it's not working, and that is because you're probably looking through the camera viewport. Now you can't actually rotate the camera and without actually locking the view to the camera, and it's probably not something that you want to do. So if your buttons are not working, just make sure that you jump to the front view, just pushing 1 there, and then you should be able to do it. Alternatively, if you wanted to change the default settings, I'm going to just hit F4, go to my preferences. Under navigation, the rotation angle, you can set this to be whatever you want if you want to make it rotate faster or slower. Also, if you have a Wacom tablet or any other type of tablet, you can map this to your settings. So I'm going to choose Blender here and map my touch ring. You can map this to be, whoops, let's just delete that. So let's clear it, Shift numpad 4, clear this one, Shift numpad 6. So now when I scroll the wheel on my Wacom tablet, it's going to do that for me. Happy drawing! Now sometimes when you open an older 2.7 file inside Blender 2.8, it can go a little bit crazy. So here is our little robot file. It looks okay, so we can actually select things in the outliner. We can jump into different modes, but if I jump into pose mode and try and grab stuff and move it around, nothing kind of seems to be working. Like I can grab it over here, but nothing in the viewport. It's like, And if I happen to try and delete something, we kind of get an indication of what's up with our file. These delete menu says point, strokes, frame, and that's the grease pencil menu. So what's going on? It's kind of stuck in grease pencil mode, and that's broken my file. So let me show you how to fix it. Okay, so here's a little bit of a demonstration of what's going on here. So here is my file. This is my broken file. And what we're going to do is we're going to append some data into a brand new file. So this one's going to be a new file. Now, normally what we do is we can just append our scene straight over into the new file. But our scene is stuck in actually like grease pencil mode. So what can we do? Well, it's pretty easy. What we'll do, rather than grabbing the whole scene to append to a new file, what we'll do, we just grab our collections and append our collections over there. So let me show you how to do that inside Blender. All right, so let's start a new file, file new. I can delete all my data here. Now the first thing I'm going to do is save it so it's in the same location. It's going to make it easier to append in data. So file, save as, and because I've already done this, I'm going to call it robot rig fix, and it's just a blank file. Now let's import our data inside this one. So let's go file, append, and then because I've already located this one, the broken rig was the rig 00. Let's choose that one. And let's just grab our collection. And thankfully, I've already had everything in a collection called robot rig. So let's just import that over. And you'll see now we're not actually stuck in any mode. I can, see, look, I can actually grab stuff and move it around. Yay, I have fixed my file.
Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. Check the link below for the full course of over 50 lessons, all of which are completely free. See you there.